Good morning, everybody. This is DP Solutions and Duo's multi-factor authentication webinar. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to get logged in, and then we'll kick things off.
This morning, we're going to do this a little bit different than we normally do. Oftentimes we talk about a particular subject matter and create the space and explain why these challenges exist. And we're still going to do that today. But we invited Vin from Duo in to talk specifically about Duo as a multi-factor authentication product. We'll get into the agenda momentarily, but we feel that today multi-factor authentication is really important to maintain security and minimize the risk of a data breach. So I'm going to start off, and I'm just going to talk about the idea about keeping private accounts safe. So login management and multi-factor authentication. For our agenda today overall for the webinar, we're going to think of authenticated accounts and the value of data. We're going to talk about the ideas of password complexity and importance and limitations, and then also why multi-factor authentication is effective. Basically, this is just me talking about sort of where we're at in 2018 as it pertains to authentication and things like that. Then we're going to pivot, and I'm going to give Vin some time to talk about how Duo specifically can be deployed and managed, and why we feel it's such a good solution to address problems and do these, really improve security, but in an easy, manageable way that isn't as troubling for people as it was in the past. So before we really begin, I just want to talk about accounts and data value. So the reason we have logins and passwords and all this stuff is that when we log into an account, the reason we set up these barriers to get into an account in the first place is that we place a value on the things that these accounts hold. So before we get into any kind of discussion about what we use to authenticate and security, we have to think about the accounts we're actually logging into and ask a few questions like, why did we even get the account in the first place? And what is the utility to me? What's the purpose of this account? Is this just my Facebook account where I just post maybe some pictures once in a while? I don't really take it too seriously. There's nothing really that private on there. Or is this my, personal investments account? Or do I have private information I don't want to share? You have to ask yourself that, and this is going to help determine the risk of that account being breached. So what could someone do if they got into the account? Would it just be embarrassing? Would it be annoying? Would it be cause you frustration and difficulty? Or would it lead to serious financial consequences? What would happen if you logged into this account one day and somebody tampered with it and somehow everything that you had in there before was destroyed? What would you miss that information? It's really important to ask yourself that too. How do you need to be able to use this account in order to realize the utility of it? So in other words, we've established that the account has value in some way, but how do we actually need to access this account in order to realize the utility of it? Do I need to work on it on just my office desktop PC, or really on any PC anywhere, or mobile devices? How do we actually get into this account, and what do we need to do to make this account productive for us? It's a really important question. And do you trust the account custodian? What guarantees do you have? So far we're talking about everything that you do, but what about the back end of this? Do we trust that the host, in this case that we're actually logging into, does a good job managing passwords on their end? Do we feel that they have proper auditing procedures, et cetera, things that make them a valuable, what I would call a data custodian? You're putting a lot of trust into, for example, Google when you put your information into your Gmail account. You're trusting that they take care of that information. And in the past, as many stories would tell you, that hasn't always been the case in terms of actually these account custodians being safe and reasonable and good about your data. So this is kind of why we established passwords, right? We're logging into these accounts, and we need to make sure that we are who we say we are before we, transfer that money or sign that document or log into our social media. So we set up passwords. And it's really the first line of defense against account intrusions and data breaches. You know, the chances are if you put a password on something and that password has any reasonable decency and you're not using password, yeah, maybe for the most part, the average person's not just going to be able to log into it without any effort. But there's some problems here. There's no uncrackable password. You know, there's a lot of formulas and things you can look up on the internet to see, you know, relative password strength. There are calculations you can make to determine how many cycles a password generator would have to go through before a password is actually cracked. So it's really just a matter of time before a password is broken, even if you're doing a lot of good things to make that password complex and difficult to guess. Not only that, but passwords can be captured in other ways besides cracking. So far, I've really talked a lot about somebody just saying, I'm going to brute force your password and eventually guess it. Well, what if I'm logged into a machine and that machine is compromised? Then I go to my online banking account and there's some kind of keylogger or something capturing data. And in that data capture, it's captured my username and password to that online account because the device is compromised, not so much the banking account, but the device that I'm entering the information into is compromised. Well, now that information can be used to breach my account, commit fraud, do whatever, and it creates a new kind of risk. And oftentimes when a device is compromised, we really don't know about it necessarily until we start dealing with the consequences. Password management is often poor. You know, one of the things I do is, and maybe people on the call will know this. You know, I do network assessments, and we have a lot of standards that we put in place for passwords. You know, how complex are the passwords? How often are they changed? Are there rules on these passwords? Are people actually following the rules, etc.? You know, it's pretty often that when I do an audit of this stuff in terms of password rules, I very often find something wrong. There are reasons that shortcuts are made with passwords, and as much as I tell people I really want you to do X, Y, and Z when it comes to password management, it's always hard to get 100% compliance with that. And so it's a fundamental flaw with managing passwords. I look at this as not looking at discouragement for passwords, but to understand the limitations. So don't look at my little lecture about the flaws in passwords and say, well, screw it. You know, I'm just going to do whatever I want with the passwords now. I'm just going to use generic things or my cat's name or whatever. You know, we still don't want to do these things, but we have to recognize that that there are flaws in this strategy. Just like the locks on your door in your home, you know, someone could break that lock. You know, it's not perfect, but it doesn't mean we get rid of the lock in the first place. So this is really creating the case for why we would deploy multi-factor authentication. And a simple definition for multi-factor authentication is using more than one thing to verify the identity of an end user. So usually a password that doesn't really change. So you still use a decently complex password. You know, let's say for the sake of argument, you know, we're talking about me. Maybe my username is B. Schmerler, and my password is some 12-character alphanumeric thing, whatever, with an exclamation point or apostrophes or whatever. But you would also need something that you have on your person. So it could be as simple as a knowledge question, which is an extra step, but maybe not the strongest two-factor authentication. Or it could be an app on your phone or something that boots up, or a little token. I think everybody at this point, especially if you're doing things like online banking, have some kind of experience using some kind of multi-factor authentication. But one of the challenges we see is effectively deploying it. But why is it so effective? Fundamentally speaking, multi-factor authentication, when you have a token on you and this token is constantly changing, that is very difficult to break. If you have a 6-digit code, for example, and that 6-digit code refreshes every minute, and that is the token required to log in after a password is cracked. That's a pretty big effort to go ahead and get into account, determine the username, break the password, and then break the token that is constantly changing. We've just really lowered the risk of a breach that much more because we've created such a high barrier for the ne'er-do-wells on the internet to do bad stuff. And so it's a really strong thing. And I think, as Vin in his slides is going to tell you, many attacks start with compromised credentials. So multi-factor authentication addresses that risk directly. So I'm going to move and pivot a little bit. You know, there's one thing we've often noticed in the past, and part of this is the reality of new technology evolving to become something more user-friendly. But there's a real myth now that multi-factor authentication is difficult to implement or hard to use or a big pain in the butt. And one of the things we really want to talk about today, and the big reason I wanted Vin involved in this presentation, was we wanted to show practical use of multi-factor authentication and why you should really lower your guard when it comes to deploying something like this in your organization, because it's really not as difficult as it used to be. It can be done very conveniently and can really reduce a lot of risk with simple investments in time and energy and money. So I'm going to pass it over now to Vin, who is the partner manager with Duo, and I'm going to allow him to continue from here. And then once he's done with his stuff, we're going to be taking some questions and inviting everybody to talk with us some more. Take it away, Vin.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. I appreciate the introduction there. And thank you, everyone, for joining the webinar today. Appreciate your time this morning. Just to talk a little bit about security and how we can secure access to sensitive resources or valuable resources that Ben just mentioned. I'm a partner manager here at Duo, and really that's just our fancy way of saying that I partner with DP Solutions to ensure that we're delivering effective security to the masses by deploying an easy-to-use multi-factor authentication solution. So that being said, I'm going to fast forward into the next slide. Ben kind of covered this already, but the textbook definition of multi-factor authentication is simply verifying someone's identity by asking them something to verify something they know, typically a username and a password, and then physically something that they have, right? Ben mentioned the different physical forms of authentication that you might have on you at a point in time, a phone, a token, etc. But really, you know, multi-factor authentication isn't a new concept, right? It's not necessarily something that has just been introduced into our lives. We've actually been using multi-factor authentication, whether we're cognizant of it or not, for years, even decades, right? And the most common example that I like to give around multi-factor authentication is when you walk up to an ATM, right? This is a really tried and true way of using two-factor or multi-factor authentication to secure a resource. So in this event, right, you walk up to an ATM and your valuable resource is cash. That machine holds cash and won't dispense cash until you present two factors, right? First, there's something that you have, your debit card, the chip on that debit card. You have to insert it into the machine, and you have to prove physical presence of that card. And then secondly, there's something that you know, right? That 4-digit PIN that you put into the machine or you enter into the machine. And only at the time that you present both factors, right? The presence of both of those things, can you access that sensitive resource or that valuable resource that the machine is holding. Another great example is, that we've been using for quite some time is when you walk up to the gas pump, right? Now, it used to be that you could just present to something physical, but now you have to enter in your zip code, right? Because the prevalence of theft was on the rise and they wanted that additional second layer of security. So that led to the question at Duo for us to really survey the masses and think about how, you know, if we use multi-factor authentication every day in our consumer lives, essentially it being placed on us, right? How does that translate to our business lives, right? How does it translate to the applications and the sensitive resources that we have internally at an organization at the enterprise level? And so we conducted a survey at Duo to answer exactly that. And what we came up with was that of the respondents and participants of this survey, 28% came back to us and said, yes, I use multi-factor authentication in my business lives. Meaning 72% of the respondents acknowledged that they only use username and password to access an application. And of that 72% that don't use multi-factor authentication, 54% didn't even know what the definition of multi-factor authentication was. So the next natural question that really comes up that we all start to think about and start getting the wheels turning in our minds is, you know, if multi-factor authentication has been around for decades, right? If it's a tried and true way to safeguard valuable resources that we all hold, why hasn't it been more widely adopted in our enterprise lives? And really, we have to take a look at the state of security as a whole, as an industry. And it's often perceived, and it's often synonymized, that security is just complicated, right? It's very bolt-on, hardware-centric, not easy to use, and friction-based. And in fact, if we go and look at what a traditional two-factor authentication deployment looks like today, right, or in the past, normally on the left-hand side, it's difficult to deploy. You have to go buy an appliance. You have to go stand it up on premise. You have to worry about the availability of that appliance, supporting it, maintaining it, et cetera, right? And then from the end user perspective, like the person that is trying to access the resource, from their side, it's often fragmented, right? It's often very difficult to use. I either have to go pull a separate piece of hardware out of my pocket, like a hardware token of some sort, raise some sort of 30-second code that's generated, and enter it back into my screen. Also, if I access a different application, it's likely that I'll have to use a different form or a different application to generate that code to authenticate and prove that's something that I have. And going back to the original question of why hasn't it been more widely adopted, simply put, inaction is just easier than taking any action. It's so disproportionately easier to do nothing than to do anything at all. And that's exactly what Duo is trying to solve for. So in comes Duo, right? We're a security company, clearly. We were founded in 2010. We have about 700 employees across the board, tens of thousands of customers with a global presence. And last year, in fact, we crossed a major revenue milestone of $100 million in annual recurring revenue, which leads to the statistic at the bottom right-hand side of the screen that we were acquired by Cisco very recently. But at the core of all this, the reason why I bring up these statistics and demonstrate our track record of success to you all is because of our philosophy. Everything that we do at this company, everything that we do at Duo Security hinges on one philosophy that we bake into all of our products and has to be present before we roll out any other solutions. And that philosophy is that security is most effective when it's easy to use. Meaning, if we can make security easy for the administrators or your teams to deploy, right, and manage on a day-to-day basis, and then on top of that, if we can make security easy for the end user who's logging into the application, the more likely your end users will work with your security initiatives and become a broader extension of your security team, as opposed to what I've showed you in the previous slide is a friction type of authentication experience will likely lead your end users to work against your security initiatives. And our core product at the focus, the center of everything that we do at Duo is is multi-factor authentication through an application that sits on your smartphone. We're entirely cloud-based. And really what it means for your end users, one tap to authenticate. There's no code to enter back into the screen. And we make it because we're cloud-based, it's quick and it's easy to deploy to enroll your end users. No longer do you have to go out and provision hardware tokens and physically hand out devices to folks. They can get enrolled within minutes. So why multi-factor authentication? Why did we, or Duo Security, decide to build an entire security solution that's founded on multi-factor authentication? And what it all boils down to is trust. How do you trust someone or something accessing your valuable resources? If we rewind before 2010, prior to Duo's founding, right, or if we even think about our environment today, the old way of establishing trust was really what I would call the moat and castle approach. So it used to be that all of your endpoints resided on premise. It used to be that your users walked into the four walls of your office every day and came physically into the office. It used to be that applications sat on servers that were on premise. So naturally, as an industry, we collectively started securing our resources that were a little bit more nice, neat, and contained, right, by building a wall around it or ring fencing it, if you will. And that's how we delineated trust, right? Everything on the outside of that wall is bad and we need to keep it out. And everything on the inside of that wall was trusted. If you were on the corporate network, you were inherently more trusted than others that were not on the corporate network. But the reason why we're on this call today, the reason why we're talking about security and multi-factor authentication is because we're cognizant that cloud and BYOD are changing the landscape as we know it, meaning there's just more external factors than that simple, nice, neat, contained environment that I just showed you. Our perimeter today, more often, looks like this. Oops, let me take a step back. Our perimeter today is more hybrid, right? Yes, you still have the concept of your corporate network. You still have the concept of a perimeter. But on the outside of that perimeter, you have other external factors that you need to consider now. First and foremost, remote employees, right? Your employees want to be the most productive versions of themselves. They want to be able to access anything from anywhere, from any device. The things that they're accessing aren't necessarily on your corporate network anymore. We have cloud applications. Microsoft is definitely not bashful about their push to Azure Cloud, right? So you're housing sensitive information that's no longer necessarily within your corporate network. And then lastly, you have the prevalence of more contractors and vendors or third-party services accessing your environment. MSPs access your environment with credentials as well, right? So when we sum this all up, right? When folks are trying to access a resource, the way that we've determined in establishing trust in today's perimeter is providing a valid username, which is easily guessed, and a valid password, which can be easily compromised or stolen. And what we're saying at Duo, the message that we're trying to get out there is the perimeter is not your sole line of defense anymore, right? Today, you just have a broader attack surface. There's more avenues to entry to your environment, and inherently with that, as you have a broader attack surface, there's a higher risk of breach. And when we look at the statistics, attackers know that as well, right? So the statistics that you see on the screen are that of the Verizon Data Breach Report. And if you're not already familiar with this report, I encourage you to take a read. It does a great job of summarizing the state of security on a year-to-year basis. And what we see time and time again, right, from the time that this report's been released, we see the same trends happening over and over, year over year. Attackers are targeting the users, right, compromising credentials, and then compromising the devices that those users have in hand. So on the screen, the statistics that we pulled from the latest breach report for us, 84% of breaches involve compromised credentials. They're simply just stealing username and password and logging in. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, 3/4 of breaches involve some sort of compromised device of some sort, likely to harness credentials. And the idea here is to reiterate the fact that attackers are motivated by the same things that you and I are motivated by on a day-to-day basis, right? We have this common perception that breaches are happening because of very sophisticated and insider type of attacks, whereas those attackers want something that's scalable and offers them the most return on their investment, right? How do I get the most back for the amount of time that I'm putting into something? And phishing attempts that we've seen are on the rise and a very prevalent and effective way of stealing those credentials. So let's take a step back, right? And let's think about how we establish trust in this modern perimeter, no longer that just solely corporate network type of environment. And the first step is to start with your user. We at Duo emphasize that multi-factor authentication is an absolute necessity for application access, right? If someone is going to confirm something that they know, like a username and password, challenge them with something that they have, like a device that they have in hand. And with us, with Duo, in the philosophy that I mentioned before, we want to make it easy. We want to make multi-factor authentication simple so that you can practice effective security in today's environment. So what does it look like? So the example that I'm going to show you right now is an end user accessing their webmail. It could be Outlook web app, which is what you see on your screen. It could be Office 365. It could be any really web application whatsoever. And as an end user, I'm enrolled in Duo already, meaning that my second factor device has already been set up, and I'm just going to log in for a normal day's action of work. So I'm going to type in my username and password, my Active Directory credentials as I normally would. I go ahead and hit sign in, and then you'll see on the screen that Duo shows up. This is our way of saying, great, thank you for verifying that something that you now need to verify something that you have. And as I mentioned earlier, we have an application that sits on your smartphone that essentially sends a notification to that user. No code, nothing else to tap in. And I'll send myself a push notification on the screen, and you'll see my phone lights up, right? Someone is trying to log into my account. And if I open up my phone, I get, me as the end user, I get a little more contextual information about the login attempt. So where it's happening from, where it's originating from, the time that it's originating, which credentials are being used, and to access what application. And this is the inflection point, right? This is when your end user starts working with your security initiatives as opposed to against them. So if I don't recognize this login attempt as an end user, I can simply hit that deny button, mark it as a fraudulent attempt, and an alert will go back to the administrator of Duo to look into the situation a bit further. But more often than not, we would hope the end user just wants to log in the way that they normally do. They tap the approve button and verify their identity, and that's it. And then I'm into the web application and Duo steps out of the way. A lot of folks ask us, what are the biggest concerns around multi-factor authentication, and how do end users perceive it to be easy? The time and time again, I hear two things. And the first of those two things is multi-factor has to be flexible. Yes, the Duo push notification is a great way and our most widely adopted way to confirm a user's identity. But what happens if that user needs an alternate way to log in, right? Are they going to call the help desk when they get locked out, or are they going to use an alternative form of authentication? So Duo supports the most forms of authentication that are out there. So first and foremost, if I don't have a smartphone or I don't have that phone on me, right, I can enroll a second device. I can call that device, press 1 to accept, press 2 to deny. In fact, call me is a function that we see time and time again for users that upgrade their phone. If I got the new iPhone XS, I don't have the Duo mobile app installed on my phone just yet, but I still need to confirm my identity and get to my day's worth of work, right? I can just call that device with my number registered to it and authenticate. The second thing is, if you don't have service on your phone, you can enter a passcode, and that passcode can be derived in a couple of different ways. We support hardware tokens, the traditional method if need be. The Duo mobile app itself can generate a 6-digit code without being online. And then if it's within your security program, right, you can also text message a one-time passcode to a device and log in that way. The idea here is to provide the most authentication methods within your security policy, of course, to make it easy for your end users to log in. The second thing that we hear often being synonymized with being easy is being consistent, right? If I log in as an end user, I don't want to be concerned about what my login experience will be like from application to application. And with Duo, we make a really concerted effort to be agnostic to what you've standardized on as a practice. If you're a Microsoft shop, great. We'll hook in with all of those applications. Whichever VPN you decided to standardize on, that's great as well. We'll be able to hook in with that. And if the majority of your applications sit on-premise or if they sit in the cloud, again, we want to be able to hook in with it with the same consistent push notification authentication to access your applications. And that being said, general rule of thumb here at Duo, if it uses Radius, if it uses SAML or LDAP to authenticate, we'll be able to hook in with it. And with that being said, right, I wanted to give you all just a visual of what practicing easy and effective multi-factor authentication looks like. So this was a large private university that enrolled in Duo, right? And what they saw at in March of 2016 was the prevalence of account takeovers. Folks were stealing usernames, and attackers were stealing usernames and passwords, and it was becoming a problem, right? So strategically, this university had to say and had to make a decision at some point to implement multi-factor authentication to start mitigating the prevalence of these account takeovers. So they started with VPN in mid-2016, and VPN consisted of 5,000 users, right? And they made that decision in about July of 2016 to roll out to 5,000 users and make it necessary for all forms of VPN access to have that second layer of authentication, prove to something that you have, right? You'll see by September of 2016, they were able to enroll 5,000 users fully for VPN. Within a matter of months, the ease of deployment, the ease of having users trained on how to use multi-factor authentication allowed them to mitigate the risk of breach, the risk of credential theft for VPN. And at that point, the rollout was so successful, right, that they decided to roll out campus-wide to all of their faculty, staff, and students for Office 365, the largest form of account takeover, or the largest source of account takeover. So at that point in time, at number 2, you'll see that they began the rollout for Office 365. By October of 2016, they had 50,000 users enrolled. And by the end of the year, they had their entire faculty, staff, and student population enrolled at 65,000 users. And at the end of the day, when you take the statistics into account, right, 96% decrease in compromised accounts just by adding that second layer of authentication. And the other consequence, or the other effect of rolling out multi-factor, is the amount of phishing domains that they had to block, a 92% decrease as well. So within less than a year, right, within a matter of months, really, they were able to protect all their users on campus, and they were able to mitigate the most common form of breach. And really, that's what we're trying to say at Duo, right? If the majority of breaches involve compromised credentials, let's solve that through multi-factor authentication. But on the right-hand side of this page, you'll see that 3/4 of breaches still involve compromised devices. And what Duo wanted to do, right, as once we built our product for multi-factors, we wanted to solve this other common form of breach as well. And we thought about how we would do this. How can we help secure devices that are accessing your sensitive applications? And simply put, we do it at the authentication layer. So when I was logging into Duo, or when I was logging into my application before, you saw Duo show up on two sides of the screen. First, on the left-hand side, you saw Duo show up as the authentication prompt on the device that's accessing the resource, right? And then on the right-hand side, you saw Duo show up on the device that's confirming the person's identity, which can also be the device that is accessing the resource. Oops, I think slides changed on me here.
I think it should be working good again.
Yep, I got it.
Right, great.
So really, Duo shows up in two places, right? And we thought as a company, what if we could funnel the device information back to you as the administrator? So if we fast forward here, right, we have something called device insight. So as those devices are hitting that authentication layer, what we're then seeing at that point in time is your administration panel populating with information about those devices. You know, are they out of date? Are they up to date? Are they securely configured? What kind of devices are they? Are they corporate owned and issued, or are they BYOD? And the idea here is to give you as much information about those devices as possible so that you can enact effective security policies within your security parameters. So as a user logs in, number one, we can warn them as they fall out of compliance with your security policy. Hey, your browser's out of date. We require you to have the latest version of browser. Of the browser release. And then secondly, if they fall out of date or a major 0 day is announced, right, you can actually block those devices based on the hygiene that we are able to assess at the time of login. On top of that, what we can also do is fingerprint devices between corporate issued and known and BYOD. So as a user logs in to a specific application, or if they're part of a specific user group, we can essentially say, hey, you know what, you're not allowed to log in to this application using a personal device. You actually have to go back to the corporate issued machine that we issued you, that we have visibility to, that we patch, manage, and maintain in order to access this specific application. And that's what the Duo mission is, right? A mission or a vision that we deliver through something called unified access. And simply put, all we're trying to say is we're trying to shift the burden of trust from just the reliance of the corporate network and shifting it into a phased approach, right? Number one, do you trust the user? Positively identify the user as they're logging in. And then once you've done that, number two, take a look at the device that they have in hand. Is it within your security policy? Is it within your security parameters? Do you want that device to be able to access that application? And then we bump that up against a policy stack that, again, sits in front of every application that you want to protect in a consistent and easy to use manner. And with that, with one solution, right, we can all work together to solve for the most common forms of breach by protecting, number one, the credential, and number two, the device. And that's it. That's pretty much all I had for you today, through the unified access vision. I really do appreciate all of your time, but yeah, I'll turn it back over to Ben, and we can answer any questions that you all might have.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. And Jill, do we have any questions?
Yes, we have a couple come in. So everybody, again, if you do have questions, please feel free to use that questions box, and we'll get them answered for you. First question is it better to get multi-factor authentication from a cell phone app or a physical token or something else?
From my perspective, I don't think it makes a huge difference whether you're using a phone or a hardware token. Vin, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say from the device standpoint itself, but the form of authentication could matter. So what we, as a security company, what we say is multi-factor authentication is better than no multi-factor authentication. But theoretically, if it's a code-based multi-factor authentication, as you enter it into your screen, that 6-digit code, theoretically, if that machine is compromised, right, someone can beat you to that 6-digit code that you're entering in the screen and submit it to your service before you do. So we do emphasize that Duo Push is a more secure form of authentication. There's no code to steal through the screen. It's actually happening out of band. But again, I would just say multi-factor authentication is better than no multi-factor authentication.
Certainly, I agree with all of that. Joe, what else do we have?
All right, next question is, am I less likely to get infected with malware if I deploy multi-factor authentication?
I think that's a very good question, and it's important to understand that being infected with malware is really independent of how you authenticate. I mean, the malware infections could occur whether you're using or not using multi-factor authentication. It's really a question of the device's security. Now, perhaps the consequences of malware may be less severe if you're using multi-factor authentication. You're keeping the accounts locked up, but the simple implementation of multi-factor authentication will not prevent you from getting malware. So I want to be clear that while we really do think multi-factor authentication should be used by probably most of the people we work with, it is not a all-in-one security solution. We still need to protect from malware and do all the other things like manage patches, deal with vulnerabilities that we would normally deal with in a little bit more traditional security strategy.
Vin, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I would totally agree with that, right? I mean, a layered approach is the best approach. And yes, with respect to malware, multi-factor authentication is not a substitute and not a replacement to those traditional forms that Ben was referring to.
Okay, excellent.
Anything else, Joe?
We do have one more question. What happens if I lose the device where I get my token from, like my cell phone?
I'll let Vin take that one. Why don't you talk about what happens if the token is lost? I'm sure people break their phones or just misplace stuff. It happens all the time. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, the flexibility around multi-factor authentication is key to make it easy, right? I'll share our experience at Duo. When a new employee is onboarded here, we ask them to enroll 2 devices. Number one, their primary device, like the smartphone that they have in hand, and then a secondary device. Personally, I have a YubiKey, I have my iPhone, and I have an iPad enrolled. So if I don't have my iPhone with me at a certain point in time, I can use one of those secondary forms to authenticate into the application. And worst case scenario, let's just say that you don't have any of those devices on hand, or you didn't enroll any backup devices. What you can do is issue a one-time bypass code to that user once you verify their identity through the help desk.
Great.
Awesome. We did have another question come in while you were answering that one. Will this allow continued access through OWA if necessary?
Then I'll let you take that one too.
Yeah, so continued access through OWA. What I'd say is when you log into Outlook web app, yes, you will verify your identity at the point of login. What we also have the ability to do is remember a session. So if the user goes to log in from a specific device, if it's in your security policy, we can remember that device for a certain period of time. You define that time based on your security policies. So when the user goes to log in again, they log in or log out of OWA, they're not prompted with multi-factor authentication each and every time they log in from that device. That session's trusted for a certain period of time. After the authentication is complete and we verify that user's identity through something that they have, Duo is out of the way at that point. Whatever they do in Outlook web app is up to them, and they would just use it as they normally would after that.
In general, leaving a session running for, we don't want people to have to log out and log back in constantly, when they're working. We don't, the beauty of Duo, and part of the reason we brought the product into the fold was that we like the idea of products that improve security but also have a pleasant user experience. And part of the idea of using this is we don't want to have to, get you to turn to the phone every time you step away for a minute or something like that. Certainly, the account needs to be timed out every once in a while. We have to re-authenticate. You shouldn't be logged into the same account permanently for a year. So anyone who jumps on this device can access the information. But at the same time, part of the reason we use MFA is to reduce those risks, so we don't have to do all this crazy stuff in terms of logging in and logging out.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah. Anything else, Jill?
There's no more questions.
All right, great. I think we have I'm sorry, whoops. Here's just a little sample of the Duo products here. Obviously, if anyone on the line has interest in these services, we'll help you right size this, et cetera, and get the implementation that's right for you. Thanks everybody for joining us. If you would like to have any follow-ups on this, feel free to contact. You can contact me, bschmerler@dpsolutions.com, or your account manager, or anybody here at DPS. And Vin, would you like to just read out your email real quick in case they want to reach out to you as well?
Sure. My email is VP, V as in Victor, P as in Peter, @duo.com.
There you go. Easy. All right, great. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. We're going to have another webinar next month. Stay tuned for more information about that. And as always, we hope this was really helpful for you. And take care and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.